In August, the FBI tipped off the RCMP about a potential terror attack in Canada. That resulted in a deadly takedown in a southwestern Ontario town that left a homegrown radical dead and a country with a lot more questions. Top of mind, do we have the right strategies to ferret out and counter violent extremism? Let's ask Michelle Shepard, national security reporter at the Toronto Star, Jamil Javani, founder of the Citizen Empowerment Project and visiting professor at Osgoode Hall Law School, and Amarnath Amarasingam, fellow at the George Washington University's program on extremism and co-lead on a study of Western foreign fighters. He is based at the University of Waterloo, and it's good to have all of you here at our table at TVO tonight. I want to start, I don't want to assume everybody has heard this story, because funnily enough, I was talking to somebody the other day who was away for the summer and entirely missed the whole Strathroy drama. So let's just do a quick recap here. 24-year-old Aaron Driver, killed in an anti-terror operation in Strathroy in southwestern Ontario. He did manage to detonate a bomb. He did manage to injure a taxi driver. He was known to law enforcement as having pro-ISIS views. He was under a peace bond, which we'll explain a little later, restricting his travel and his online activity. Interestingly enough, it was the FBI who alerted Canadian authorities to the fact that he was a problem. Okay, let's do a little piece of online video that has been released to date, and then we'll come back and chat. Sheldon, roll that clip if you would, please.
There's a fire burning in the chests of every Muslim, and this fire can be cooled only by the spilling of your blood. Your war on Islam is not the kind of crime we allow ourselves to dismiss, to forgive, or to forget, inshallah. You will pay for everything you ever brought against us. Whether you drop a bomb or fire a single bullet, we will hold you accountable for this, inshallah. Whether you spend millions in the war against Islam or you spend a single cent, we will hold you accountable, inshallah.
That's Aaron Driver. Okay, Amarnath, to you first. What does this whole case say about the state of Canada's anti-terrorism efforts?
I think it says a lot of good things about the state of anti-terrorism in Canada, I think, because unlike some of the individuals we've had in Europe who've launched all kinds of attacks over the last couple of months, Aaron Driver was already known to law enforcement, partly through his own efforts of being very vocally pro-ISIS, unapologetically pro-ISIS online. And so he was monitored for quite a while. He was on a peace bond.
Want to just explain what that is?
So a peace bond is a kind of restriction on an individual's behavior, which for Aaron Driver was one of the heftiest we've seen in a while. So he wasn't allowed to have a Twitter account, a Facebook page. He was on a GPS monitor. He had a curfew. He wasn't allowed to own a laptop. His cell phone had to be given to him by the RCMP, and on and on and on. And so he was restricted in his behavior, was well known to law enforcement.
And well known to you.
And well known to me.
You knew him.
We knew him because we were called, so he was online for quite a while, and we were in touch then, and we were called by his lawyers to come and basically answer the unanswerable question of, is this guy a threat to Canada, as part of his peace bond trial. And so we sat down with him for about 3 hours.
When's the last time you spoke to him?
I spoke to him last in April of this year, 3 months before the attack.
Did he seem to you to be the kind of a guy who represented a threat to people in this country?
No. So in our dealings with him, I mean, this is the difficult question of the difference between someone who holds radical views and someone who acts on those views. And the debate is whether that's a kind of conveyor belt. Anyone who holds a radical belief will eventually act on those beliefs, and therefore everyone who holds certain beliefs should be monitored and watched, which is fundamentally impossible. Or, as the research suggests, are they actually two different kinds of people, right? Are people who talk are very different than people who do things. And therefore, you can monitor the people who do things by looking at who they're talking to, the kinds of activities they're involved in.
All right, so then when you heard that he had planned to create some havoc, and that he was in fact killed in the process of trying to wreak that havoc, what went through your head?
I was very curious about the last few months, and so I spoke to him in April, and he basically said, you know, I'm working now, I have a good group of friends, things are going well, you know, and how are you doing, and what's going on with your life and your family, and so on. And this was April. And so my question is, what happened in May, June, and July? And one of the main things that happened that kind of supports the video that you just showed is that the call came from ISIS Central for more attacks against the West. And this video that you just saw is basically what's known as an oath of allegiance video of him giving an oath of allegiance to Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS. And so something clicked or something snapped in between May, June, and July that set him on a different kind of trajectory, I think. And I think seeing those attacks in France and other places may have kind of influenced him to do something that was different. Again, there's no real evidence of what happened, but I mean, this is my kind of speculation based on the contents of the video, which are very reflective of all of the other videos that we've seen in the last year.
Let me ask Michelle about that video. When you look at him making that statement, do you take it seriously?
Again, that's the difficult question. All the points that Amar raised, how do you know? He didn't think he was a threat. He spent time with him. Sometimes you look at these videos and they're kind of laughable. I mean, they're ridiculous. And you think, you know, this guy certainly can't be a threat. But as Amar mentioned, there is sort of a pattern to those who then plan attacks, this Pledge of Allegiance. And so you can't ignore it.
Do you know what he planned to do?
Do we know what he planned to do?
Does anybody have any sense of what he planned to do?
There's actually still a lot of questions about that case. The one that's troubling for me is why it took a tip supposedly from the FBI to alert Canadians to this. So I think there'll still be some questions that hopefully will get answered.
Meaning our authorities should have been on top of this and should not have to have been tipped off by foreign authorities.
Well, it's we know that they were not monitoring him, and I think that there are a number of people, they say they have a list that's huge, and how do you know who is actually at a risk? So whatever their calculation is, he was pushed further down. But you would think there would be some sort of electronic monitoring that should pick up something. And I haven't really heard answers to those questions yet.
Having said that, should we be pleased that the two security services from two different countries appear to have worked well together in order to prevent something truly disastrous from happening?
Sure, absolutely. In this case, it shows that this is a success in that matter. I also, though, would caution that sometimes we've run into trouble with this type of cooperation. And, you know, the Meher Arar case wasn't that long ago, and that's why there were certain, they call them MOUs, Memorandums of Understanding, put in place, and certain provisions about sharing information. So it's sometimes a catch-22.
Meaning people who turn out to be innocent can be taken away, virtually kidnapped, and renditioned off to all sorts of awful things happening to them.
I mean, that was that case, and there was...
That was the Meher Arar case.
Right.
Okay, let me get you in here, Jamil. You've been away for the last 6 months. We talked to you when you were overseas, actually, in Belgium.
Yeah, we did while I was in Molenbeek, yeah.
Yes, okay. So let's just go through the list. Where were you visiting while you were overseas?
I spent time in Europe, so I was in France and Belgium and some other European countries, and I went to Egypt and Kenya and South Korea and Australia.
And what was the point of the trip?
Well, initially it was, I think the Aaron Driver case may have this effect on some people too, where after the Paris attacks, I kind of had this breakthrough moment where I started to see how things that happen in Western countries and our own policies and our own cultural forces put young people in positions of vulnerability to these kinds of ideas. And when I saw who organized the Paris attacks, and I saw like they grew up in the same kind of neighborhood as me, they grew up listening to the same music, having the same kind of, you know, fantasies about being a gangster one day. And I said, you know, maybe there's something that we could learn about what's happening in our own countries. And so that's why I initially went to Europe. And I kind of chased what I learned there and found my way to different countries as I went. It wasn't a very well-planned trip when I initially left Toronto.
But clearly the experiences that you shared with the people who we're focusing on in this program, you know, at some point you either grew out of it or realized that you know you were not going to be affiliated with that lifestyle.
Yeah.
They didn't get that message. Why do you think?
Yeah, well, I think like the big breakthrough that I had, I think, which is kind of separating this issue from the identity politics, where we can actually talk about it without getting kind of too focused on particular communities, or this ideas kind of transcend identity in some ways. And Aaron Driver is an example of that. His background is very different from, I think, how people stereotypically think about who's vulnerable to these ideas. So I think that's a big part of it, is like seeing like what is happening locally that puts young people in a position where they start to think that these ideas this make sense? And in a lot of neighborhoods in Toronto, we have youth organizations that work with young people who are on the verge of believing self-destructive and destructive things, and they help pull young people back into a place of positivity. And I think the response that most countries that I travel to and most countries I read about have to radicalization is not to start with people who know how to do that. Not to say who in my city already knows how to work with young people and bring them to a place of positivity. The starting point is to say, well, we need to build a whole new set of knowledge and a whole new set of experiences on how to deal with these particular young people. And that's, I think, the identity politics at play. It's us saying some young people are different than others. And I think in a country like this and a city like ours, we've proven that that's not the case, that young people have common challenges, and where their parents come from or who they pray to is not central to how they're going to experience life.
But let me pick up on that notion of background, and Amarnath, I'll go to you on this. You know, Driver in his background had some things that seem to be classic problems that a lot of disaffected youth show, right? His mother died when he was very young. One of his best friends was shot and killed. Lousy relationship with his father. I mean, clearly coming from not coming from a happy family situation. Yeah. Is that enough to have got him on a bad path, which ultimately led to his demise?
That's a very difficult question, because I mean, there's a lot of, and he lost a baby when he was 17, and all of these things. The difficulty is, of course, lots of people go through life challenges like that, and they don't follow the same trajectory. And so we've had, I've interviewed quite a bit of members of ISIS and members of Al-Qaeda who are, come from entirely normal backgrounds, are quite wealthy. Even some Canadians like Salman Ashrafi from Calgary, he was married, had a kid, was at a $100,000 paying job and at Talisman Energy, and he went off and blew himself up in Iraq. I've interviewed people in Brussels who had, had a 10-year-old daughter, and they left, and the 10-year-old daughter is still writing letters to her father saying, when are you coming home? And even though he's, been dead a year and a half. And so there's a lot of these kinds of stories where it seems like, in retrospect, they're causal factors. But at the time, it's very difficult to pinpoint. And we've had this with Michael Zihaf-Bibo, also the attacker in Ottawa, where in retrospect, we look back, and it's a kind of weakness on our theorizing in a way, because we look back and say, oh, he had a drug problem. Oh, there was a divorce. Oh, there was this, and that. And so in retrospect, we kind of pick things that could have been important. But at the time, they probably weren't that important.
And of course, that describes
a lot of people.
Hundreds of thousands of people in this country who go through that.
So that's the difficulty, is drawing that causal link.
Michelle, I wonder if you can add to that in as much. I got to tell you, I read all your stuff. It was absolutely top drawer. You did some fantastic reporting over the past, on an Atkinson fellowship, so you had a year basically to look at this issue. And in all of your reporting, do you feel you are any closer now to unlocking the secret of what turns somebody who is, a typical everyday Canadian kid into a jihadist?
No, but in part because I don't actually think there is one thing that unlocks. I think sometimes we try and look at these really simplistic solutions, and as Jamil mentioned, that we try and sort of reinvent the wheel and think of this as something incredibly different. And I think that's a lot of the problem that a lot of countries have been facing in terms of dealing with this. And you made an excellent point in terms of look at people who are already dealing with youth and are able to reach out to these youths, and then build on that and try not to make it such a colossal new issue, because a lot of the base factors are the same for even things such as gangs or cult recruitment. You're seeing a lot of that, and there's a lot of parallels that we can draw on. But we've tended, and this has been our problem really, if you go all the way back to some policies that came in after 9/11, we do tend to overreact, and then sometimes the policies we put in place actually exacerbate the problem rather
Plant
than
the seeds of.
They do, and they just sort of widen a rift between communities.
So the people who say more surveillance, harsher penalties, more resources for law enforcement, let's get in their face, that's not necessarily the way to go?
I don't think I think that you cannot say this is a law enforcement problem. And I think that has been part of the problem, that when we get scared, that's where all the resources go. This is a community issue. There's a lot of different factors that need to be in play here. And I think that bolstering, community programs, and there are some good ones that are underway around the world, are going to address the problem better than just more resources to surveillance and law enforcement. Having said that, nobody at this table would suggest that there aren't people, obviously, that need to, be prosecuted, and that I do think our security services are a bit overwhelmed. But I don't think it should be all in, their playing field, really.
Gotcha. Here's one new angle on this story, and that is Canada's Public Safety Minister, Ralph Goodale, has announced a new position. He says the Liberals are going to up their game and hire a de-radicalization advisor. Let's hear from Ralph Goodale on what that job might entail. Roll the clip, please.
That person will be directing a very important effort to up our game in Canada in terms of recognizing and understanding the process of radicalization, who's vulnerable to it, why they would be vulnerable, and what are the most effective tools and instruments and people and techniques and practices to prevent the problem in the first place. And after, in other cases where the problem has begun to develop, how do you intervene strategically that will have an effect?
Ralph Goodale, Liberal Cabinet Minister from Saskatchewan. Based on what you've been able to tell so far, the Liberal government's approach to fighting this compared to the previous Conservative government's approach to fighting this, how different?
Oh, there's no comparison. I mean, I think the previous government in many ways made the problem worse and just, governed by the politics of fear. So definitely we've seen a marked improvement with the Liberals. Having said that, that coordinator position was announced quite some time ago. It's not filled yet. There's been opposition to Bill C-51. Most of that hasn't been addressed yet. So it's been really slow in coming out. I do look forward to seeing who's promoted to that position. I don't think it's actually an incredibly important position, except in the optics. Who is appointed and their coordinating power. But I would hate to see any type of federal program that is initiated by this office. I think it really has to be local, and what works in Montreal may not work in Toronto, may not work in Vancouver. So it really should be a coordinating body, and we'll see what happens to that.
What hopes do you have for this position?
Well, one of the things I saw is that in every country I went to, the theory of why there's this problem is different. So in Belgium, it's this kind of interconnection between violent extremism and kind of struggling minority communities where there's high crime and low employment and things like that. In Egypt, it's an ideological one, and there are people who have different debates about the role of interpreting Islam. And then in a place like Kenya, there's talks about kind of illegal immigration and the Somali-Kenya border. So it takes a different shape everywhere, and I think the common thread between all of it is people needing to recognize that no one has the proper answer to the question, and are you using your money in a way that helps you answer it at some point in the future? So I think a key is to recognize with some humility that there needs to be some degree of experimentation and putting resources in the hands of those who may know how to engage with young people but haven't had the capacity to take their activities and put it towards some disaffected young people who they're currently not working with. So in a place like Jane and Finch, for example, where I live in northern Toronto, we have one of the higher kind of stigmatized crime rates in the city. And there are people every day who are saving young men in particular from stepping into a life of crime and making big mistakes and living out these kind of fantasies that we see in the video, right, of being like Rambo and being this hero and being a tough guy. And I think those are people who offer really important insights into how to work with young people in a variety of ways. And I think if we are putting resources in their hands to test their ideas in other places and to see, can your model work for young people outside of Jane and Finch who might be vulnerable to these ideas, that to me is a starting point of figuring out, can we test new ideas to solve this problem and admit that we might not know the best way to do this right now.
We are normally an acronym-free zone here because there are just way too many, but I'm going to break the rule here to just talk about CVE, Countering Violent Extremism. There are apparently, this is a new thing, there are new CVE programs that governments everywhere are looking into. Can you, I see you're shaking your head already.
There's just so much money out there for this. I mean, it's the new...
Is it a scam?
It's the new thing.
I wouldn't say it's a scam, but it is definitely where everybody's putting all their resources. That, this is the way that if we throw billions of dollars, and I mean, the States has been great for this, and I say great sarcastically. I mean, they've created whole new departments and just, had this program that has really, I think, been recognized as a failure now. Which was to do the anti-narrative, right? So to get out on Twitter and be like, don't join Daesh, it's bad. And it was just basically like your grandpa saying, don't do drugs. And so many resources went into that. So I think while yes, it's good to study CVE, sometimes we've had this discussion before that we kind of roll our eyes because everybody's now a CVE expert, and there are tremendous resources. Whereas I don't think the problem in North America anyway is that enormous. I think actually some very small changes could make some big differences.
And it ties into our earlier conversation about the uniqueness or the supposed uniqueness of the terrorism issue, right? Because what's happened in a lot of communities in Canada is that funding has actually been stripped from basketball camps, after-school programs, mentorship programs. And there's actually a very cynical narrative within some of these communities which say, you lost your money for basketball camps. Well, just throw in the word radicalization in your next grant proposal. In your next grant proposal, throw in CVE radicalization, and the money will come. It's the same program.
It's pretty cynical, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the same program, but it's pretty accurate,
but it's
right?
working.
Because the problem with seeing this as a unique problem is that we've stripped all these other previous programs that did work and did have some influence on the youth, and now we see it as something that needs a brand new idea to address it, when as Jamil was saying, it's not necessarily the case in terms of the push factors anyway. And so with respect to the federal program, I'm very curious to look at the specifics and what it actually looks like, because as Michelle said, none of these programs are actually functional federally, because if we look at the foreign fighters that have left from Canada, what leads a Somali youth from Edmonton to go to Syria is fundamentally different than what leads a white convert from Ottawa to go to Syria. And so if you have a federal program, I don't know how this is going to trickle down in terms of these local communities, local ethnic backgrounds, religious backgrounds. And
one program is not going to solve those two very disparate situations.
I don't see how it would, yeah.
Well, CSIS may agree with you, because according to this report that they've just released, they expressed skepticism as to the relevance of CVE initiatives, highlighting the lack of supporting empirical evidence thus far to measure their effectiveness. Is it your view as well that CVE programs may not be all they're printed up to be?
Well, I think every CVE program is different, and there may be some designs that work well and there may be some that don't. I think this kind of feels to some degree like, we've spoken before about kind of the relationship between minority communities and police departments, and it feels very similar in that sense, in that we have this big national conversation happening about an issue that's captured so much attention, but the answers are actually on the ground and at a local level. And I think that's where CVE may be helpful, is where we see opportunities in particular neighborhoods, in particular cities, where we say, all right, if we put some more resources in the right people's hands, it can have a positive impact on people. That's the question that I think we should answer, because I think at a broad level, we're not going to know whether CVE generally works or generally doesn't until we look at a local level and see where's the money actually going and who's actually getting the resources in their hands.
Is there a fear that this could exacerbate problems as opposed to solving them? Because if you get a full court press on a particular community, they will feel alienated and worse? That is a problem.
I think that's the only, there's often people say, well, why not try it? Why not try it? We should do something. And to some degree, I agree with that. But there's always that problem that, sure, if you have, let's say the RCMP program, they had a counter CVE type program. And I was always very critical of that, because, the RCMP in Ontario and Quebec, they don't interact in the community, unless it's a terrorism investigation. So if you're going to go play soccer with the kids after prayers on Friday, and then on Saturday morning your buddy's going to, even if it's a different department, your buddy's there, hanging around the country-style donut shop asking for intelligence, it's just never going to work. And that's, not to slight the RCMP too much. I know some of the people who were working in that, and they were trying their best, but it's just not fair. That's just not the place to do it.
The UK tried something, right? This PREVENT program in the United Kingdom. Did that work?
Well, this is what I was going to say, is you kind of have to decide before going in whether you're going to counter the V or the E, right? Because in Canada, we've very specifically focused on radicalization to violence. So we only care about the violence. Whereas in the UK, they've actually gone a step further and said, we care about the ideas. We care about the extremism itself. And that's deeply troubling and deeply problematic, because if you're going to monitor a whole bunch of people who hold what you consider to be conservative or extreme religious beliefs, you're going to end up surveilling the wrong people or surveilling a whole lot of people and monitoring a whole lot of people and actually using other members of the community to monitor these kinds of things. And that's the kind of criticism that's come out of Prevent, is you've turned the community itself into informants against one another to monitor these extreme beliefs that you've kind of come up with. And so I think Canada the Canadian focus is much more doable in a way, because we're focused on, okay, we care about the violence. If you believe a whole bunch of weird stuff, that's fine. But the moment you pick up that first weapon or the first stone, that's when we kind of care what you're doing or what you're thinking.
Is that the right approach to take?
Yeah, I completely agree that we believe in free speech here, right? And people have a diversity of opinions
Even
and ideas.
extremist speech.
Yeah, as long as it's not hateful and as long as
extremist
it's not leading to crime, right? And so I think the key is to make sure people are open about it. And when young people get ideas, whether it's from the internet or from a friend of theirs, that they have adults in their life they can go to talk about these things. But when we criminalize the ideas and what people say, then there's young people who just hold it in. And the only people they talk to are people who also agree with them. So it becomes this kind of a self-satisfying exercise of I'm going to say I'm really mad about something, and then the other person is going to tell me that I'm right. And so it allows you to create this alternative world where what you believe is actually like a significant, powerful idea that everyone you know believes in, because you haven't had the freedom to test it with other people. And I think that should be our concern, is pushing people to the underground. What we want is people who have different political beliefs to come out there, talk about them, and exchange ideas with other people.
Was one of the countries you went to Denmark?
No, but I did have a delegation from Denmark came to Belgium while I was there, and I did get to kind of compare what they're doing there and what is happening in Belgium. And I know that Michelle's kind of written about that.
You've read my mind. That's where I'm going next. I got to tell you, the videos and the reporting you did from Denmark were, well, okay, I've said it already, but it was really fascinating. Tell us about your trip to Denmark, this city of what, 350,000 people?
That's right.
Where they've got something really quite unique and extraordinary going on.
I went there a couple times and I was really impressed. And I don't think, before I sing its praises, I don't think you can take the Outhouse Denmark model and bring it here. I mean, there's just differences between Canada and Denmark. But I think...
Say the name of the town again?
Oh, I hope I'm saying it correctly. Outhouse?
Outhouse.
I think.
Is that right?
Outhouse.
Okay.
Outhouse.
Yeah, it's a Danish accent.
Wrong, but we'll be wrong.
I don't know. Do they get TVO in Outhouse?
They get it everywhere.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll let you know if I'm corrected.
Okay. What are they doing there?
Well, it's a program that they actually had before, which again goes to the point that we keep repeating. You know, look at what you already had and build on that. So they actually had a problem with right-wing extremism there, and they adapted that for what they're dealing with now. It is a police program, which ultimately, where it starts, which ultimately I don't always think is a great idea, but I'll explain, I think, why it works there. And then very quickly when they identify someone, it goes into a mentorship program. And the youth who's at risk gets hooked up with someone in the community who basically replaces what ISIS, Daesh was to them. I mean, and that's kind of the basic of all of this. Anything we talk about.
Let's do an example, because
Sure.
this 20-year-old kid named Mohammed.
Yeah,
I don't know if that's his real name, but that's what you're calling
It actually is his name, but we didn't use his last name. He was a great kid. We spent a lot of time with him. And he was someone who came from Somalia when he was very young, grew up in Denmark, and he just sort of felt a bit of the 9/11 backlash. And he, in class one day, got really upset at a student who was disrespecting Islam. And he yelled out that she should be stoned. And it immediately...
Stoned as in?
Stoned, as in stoned, killed.
Stoned, yes.
And rightfully so, the students were upset, the principal was upset, but it became a police matter so quickly. And they humiliated him, and they searched his house, and his family was thrown out. He was ostracized in the community. And that actually really played into a part of pushing him
That radicalized him.
It did. I mean,
Helped.
it helped radicalize him. And he went to the mosque, and the mosque was a bit afraid of him. And so he found this group of other kids who were like, yeah, we've been through that before. We know what it's like. We've felt racial profiling. You're not really accepted in Denmark. And of those kids, 3 actually went to Syria. And Mohammed was the first to enter into this CVE program. And he was set to leave, and he just met this cop, and this is why it works there. This police officer who's in charge of this program, Thorleif Flink, he just gets it. I mean, he just is an incredible person. He just is so non-judgmental. He answers his cell phone on holidays. He's texting these kids all the time. Like, he really, really believes in it. And he just said, listen, come in for a coffee. And he talked him off the ledge. And then he quickly sort of stepped back and he hooked him up with this amazing mentor in the community. So it sounds really simplistic, but the reason Our House works is because, and it's not a big program, but it works because the people involved, like they just really, really care about it. They really get it. And it's only a handful of people. It's really not that many.
And Mohammed has been brought back from the brink.
Yeah, so Mohammed, not only has he been brought back from the brink, because this was actually, he was really early in terms of his radicalization. The friends went in 2012, I think, 2013.
Weren't they killed? Were a couple of them
yes,
killed?
Yeah.
So a couple of his friends went over there.
Two were killed.
And were killed.
And one is still there. And Mohammed is now actually going to be a mentor as well. So he's now trying to help other kids. And, you know, what better mentor is that, you know, than someone who's been like, I've been there. Like, you know, the cops were in my house. I also believed what you believed. And you know what? I still think it's a travesty what Assad's doing. And you can be angry about that. But let's go protest. Let's do this. You know, let's do something else other than, you know, giving up everything and go joining this crazy group.
Obviously, people are going to want to know whether or not what's happening there in Aarhus, or however it's pronounced, could work here. What do you think?
I think it can, and I think a lot of the older programs that already exist in Canada did kind of do that. I mean, in the Somali community in Toronto, for example, you know, you had very effective and very long-running mentorship programs where mentors were paired up with people who dealt with issues of drugs and gang violence and those kinds of things. And of course, you know, these are some of the things that have been defunded and underfunded. And so I think the common denominator in all of this, of course, is the sense of belonging and a sense of brotherhood that comes from being involved with other people who believe certain things, right? And so if you're going to strip individuals of that world, you have to make sure you replace it with something and you give them some other kind of anchor to find their meaning and find their identity. I mean, going back to Aaron Driver, what I think happened there was, you know, he was stripped of, in his case, it was the online world. He was in touch with all these people in Syria, all these people who were supporters of ISIS, and this is where he found his meaning and his sense of who he was. And the peace bond, in a surprising way, kind of stripped him of all of that and said, you're not allowed to ever talk to any of these people ever again, which makes sense. But of course, we didn't then say, well, you can talk to these other people, and they know what you're talking about. We just kind of left him there saying, go find a job, you know, make sure you don't own a laptop, but go find a job and go live your life. So that I think if you're gonna replace something, you need to give them some other community to belong to, and that's key.
Does all of this evoke memories for you in Molenbeek, where you were earlier this year?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there are people who have like all sorts of stories about where the turning points in their lives are, where they thought they were going to go on a certain trajectory towards, I'm going to go to Syria one day, or I'm going to want to join this group one day.
Tell us why you went there. Why'd you go to Molenbeek in the first place?
Well, the reason why I went there is because I thought what I read about it was very similar to places I grew up, and I kind of thought, you know, if people who do work on the ground there and people who do work on the ground where I live kind of had some sort of dialogue, maybe we all get better at the end of the day, right? And so that's kind of why I decided to go there first. And what I found is it is very similar, and one of the most important things that are similar is that almost people who have money and resources and kind of influence over policy are very disconnected from the people who do the work on the ground. And what we're describing, like what Michelle's describing with that quality mentorship that's required to change people's lives, it's a skill. Like, you have to be very good at it, and you have to have experience in doing it. And not anyone can just pick it up overnight. And I think people in government and people who have resources at their disposal who fund these projects have a very difficult time distinguishing between who knows what they're doing and who doesn't. And what I saw in Molenbeek was a community saying, we know who can do this. We know who needs the support from people with money. And those are the voices that were often silenced. And that's what I see happening here in neighborhoods here as well, not on the terrorism issue, but on other issues, that people in the community have a sense of who has the ideas, who has the answers, or at least the beginnings of an answer. And those are often the people who are not getting the support that they need. And I think that was a very common thing between Molenbeek and Jane and Finch and Malvern and Rexdale and other neighborhoods that are around who deal with these high concentrations of dissatisfied and vulnerable young people, that we just don't have great dialogue happening about who actually is doing work that needs the support.
Let's, in our remaining moments then, let's consider this. The point of terrorism, obviously, is to terrorize. And we know that if you looked at the math of it, the odds of anybody in this country being victimized by a terrorist attack are not great, right? But same odds on winning the Irish sweepstakes or something like that. Michelle, how should the average Canadian understand the threat posed to them by violent extremism?
Well, with that question, I appreciate, the hypocrisy sort of. We've devoted a show to talking about this. This has been my beat since 9/11. Both of these gentlemen study it. So I do think it's important to talk about it, but I do think we really obsess about it. I mean, especially if you look at the States right now and the fact that that's, such an important part of the campaigning when the threat really is so much lower. There's much more important issues. I think, and again, I don't mean this to sound trite, but I think people have to expect that there's a chance we will have attacks. I mean, there's no reason why Canada would be immune. And something much more serious than what happened at Parliament Hill. And it's absolutely a possibility. And if it does, I think we have to react calmly, as best we can. And I don't think that you need to reinvent, the law or dump resources, as we talked earlier, into law enforcement when that's not necessarily the area to put it in, all the resources. I think we just have to keep it in perspective.
How about you on that?
No, I couldn't agree more. I mean, since we're talking about our travels, I just got back from Mogadishu, and it's very, very similar there. I mean,
why would you go to Mogadishu?
Well, I went there particularly to study their defector program of their very unique and interesting way of they get people out of Al-Shabaab, and back into normal life. But what's interesting about Mogadishu is there's gunfire all the time, people testing their weapons in the sky for no reason, car bomb goes off once a week, and people just go about their day, right? And so in a way, it's been kind of normalized in a way I think is bizarre to me, but it's
a bit of a rough comparison, but yes, it is normalized there. Yes.
Yeah. But I think it does need to get normalized here. It's not going to happen in any major way. The number of youth that have left from Canada to Syria is about 100, which compared to France and Belgium and other places is minuscule.
But still inexplicable to Mr. and Mrs. Everyday Canada.
Sure.
If there's even 100 people in this country who would want to give whatever we're doing here up to go fight in Syria.
Sure, but I mean, the percentage of those who are interested in attacking Canada is going to be even less than that, right? Yeah. And so the reasons why people are going to Syria is going to be is very different than why they would see Canada as the enemy itself. And so I do think we need to keep things in perspective here, because we do kind of freak out about this issue at a scale that is, and I say that as someone who studies it all the time. But I do think we need to kind of calm down a little bit about it.
I appreciate and I don't want to use the word hypocrisy, but let's just call it what's the word we're looking for here? I mean, it is kind of amusing that we're spending a lot of time talking about this. And of course, the world has obsessed about this issue since 9/11, the anniversary of which is, the 15th anniversary is coming up very soon. And you've all dedicated a great part of your lives to this, because it is maybe the fascinating phenomenon of the last decade and a half. And yet perspective is important, isn't it?
It is. So you could look at Toronto and say, compared to any city our size in North America, our violent crime is really, really low. But that doesn't mean that it's not worth talking about or trying to fix. And I kind of look at it this way, which is every time there's a shooting in Toronto, it's we're very small compared to Chicago, for example. Mm-hmm. But behind that one incident, there's tons of young people who are struggling. Mm-hmm. And they might not express it in that extreme way, but it's still there. And it's behind what we see in the news is when you see that one headline, there's hundreds of kids behind that headline. And that's kind of what I think the best way to take the natural interest that the public has in this issue and to direct it towards that, to direct it towards the fact that these are all extreme instances of deep problems that we have among young people, and often among young people in the fastest growing communities in the Western world. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something we have to be very conscious of, and we plan around that yes, the extreme examples are what we all know, but the people behind that are the ones we need to address through our policies and our programs and things of that nature.
Gotcha.
And maybe just, as a community, understand it. Take the time to go past the tweet or read some of the articles, understand where it's coming from, and then as a community, we have to be part of the solution, some ownership for it.
I think you've all helped us do that tonight. Thanks everybody. Great discussion. Much appreciated.
Thanks.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.